Hello, and welcome to another episode of Discussion with Simone on philosophy. Today, we have decided to talk on an entirely different topic, not commonly talked about in a philosophical term, but it remains one of the major philosophies of the world. It's called Marxism. Essentially, Marxism implies that in a society there should not be any class, but the so-called classless society, so that the profits that nowadays goes to the rich will be distributed among us all. Marxism had far-reaching consequences in the world, and today we will be discussing mostly about our understanding of Marxism and how it has influenced world politics as a whole, and also some of its applications. And we'll also be briefly discussing its place today before concluding. All right, so as usual, I'll be asking some questions to Simone, and Simone will be giving her views, and then probably I'll attempt to conclude the session. So that's the format of today's discussion. So, Simone, welcome once again to the show. What you understand by Marxism? If you could tell us a bit, then we can probably get it started.
So, to understand Marxism, you'd have to understand who exactly Karl Marx was. He was a writer in Germany around the early 19th century, and he was one of the first members of the Communist Party, and they were initially against private property and the class system. He became rather well known there, and eventually he got kicked out. He moved to London with his friend Frederick
Angel. Yeah.
Engel, and they wrote a lot of work together. The whole premise of Marxism is that, well, it's more of an economic theory than a philosophy. It's the idea that power should be vested in the people instead of just bigger players. So, say you have your capitalistic system of bosses and workers, you usually have people of a minority, the bosses make giving all your shots, and they're the ones who make the decisions, while the workers tend to be underpaid and overworked. So Marxism offers an answer to that by saying that all people should be paid equally for one, and that all that excess money that a company makes should be handed out to the common people.
Yeah. So just one thing, I mean, in that context, we very often hear about terms like communism, socialism. So how are they interchangeably, are the terms interchangeable, or they have got different meanings?
I mean, they're definitely treated as much. The whole communist ideology was kind of a thing before Marx added on his bit to it. Marxism specifically is just his specific ideas in addition to the main tenets of communism. Socialism is seen as a slightly less extreme version of communism, you might say. And you can see it in a lot of modern day governments like Cuba and Netherlands and China as well. Though, one thing that I feel like I should mention is that even for the most part, countries like China and also the Nazi Party, which called themselves socialists, they didn't really operate on communist market, which is something that they said they would do. It was basically a very capitalistic market, except for the fact that the parties would govern their govern the economy and trade very a bit stricter than usual. So it was still pretty much a capitalistic market in those countries, but they had some just a bit of communism thrown in.
Yeah, yeah, that's all right. I mean, so although I mean, so communism, the Marx is the philosopher
Yeah.
essentially, who talked about his ideas, very much assisted by Angel, his friend. Although communism is more of an ideal, isn't it? And socialism is that ideal when it is applied to different countries or states,
Yeah, you could say
as
so.
you mentioned. Yeah. So from that perspective, I was just wondering the concept of freedom. I mean, Karl Marx talked a lot about that. That he thought human beings are basically born free, but most of the times we are not free to think. And from a social perspective, he attributed it to the capitalists or the so called rich people, corporates, which take away much of the profit, isn't it? So that was his version of um, communism, the way he thought about it. So my point I wanted to mention is that as a philosophy, it had far-reaching consequences all over the world. As you mentioned that many countries were sort of adopted that ideology, like Cuba, as you mentioned, and part of like USSR, now called Russia. They were the major players of Marxism, which later basically translated to communism. Um, so, how it differs from capitalism? Could you tell a little bit more about that?
All right,
Because that
so
seems to be one of the major contentions.
you have your whole structure of um, your bosses. They buy the equipment for you, and then you are the one who has to like work on it. And then it eventually becomes a rather unfair power imbalance where you have workers putting hours in, and they're very expendable to most corporations because work is specialized, as Marx would call it, and people could easily be replaced if there was something to gain from it. And Marx, he didn't really like the whole thing about profit. While a capitalist might see profit as something that comes through innovation, Marx saw it as stealing your the efforts and skill of the people who work for you.
Yeah, I think that's essentially what uh, I mean the way they differ it. In fact, there is a popular misconception that Marx hated capitalism. He didn't think that capitalists are evil per se, but he thought that their philosophy is a bit flawed or they're a bit naive in the sense that they themselves are not happy being capitalist. There is power struggle and there are lots of easy corruption that creeps up in capitalism, and to keep people poor, they devise ways. So that is the major contention that Marx had with capitalists. And to the other extent, when uh, like the communism that spread to other countries where people forcibly took land from the landowners, like the rich people or the people who belong to the kingly sort of communities or kingly part of the society. So some people took to arms to enforce communism. So that is one of those what do you call offshoots, you can say, of communism. Uh, What happened? I mean, always like any other society, there are there are differences. I mean, even communists, there are corruption is there as well. So one of the criticism of Marxism is that he probably took a very idealistic view, like he diagnosed the issue, but he didn't quite give us a way how we will be following or what will be treating the problem. That's one of those one of the major criticisms. One book, very popular book. Marx wrote so many books. One is popular book. One of my favorites as well is Communist Manifesto. In which he talks about how there should be a classless society. We should have more leisure, and the bank would be centralized, and our communication should also be centralized, so that people don't own anything in it. So it might sound good theoretically, but some people believe that it is probably not very ideal, and they quote the example that how so-called the major communist countries are failing in it. Do you have any comments on that?
I mean, the thing is, he had a point with a lot of the statements he made, especially about the fact that capitalism was pretty unstable. But I have to say that most of the countries that followed suit, they didn't really fall due to communism per se. It was just the fact that a lot of those countries ended up with totalitarian governments, like the USSR, and they just didn't really manage it well. You do have evidence of good ways that the system's implemented, like the way some Scandinavian countries did it. They it basically like um, allows for funds to be redistributed to pretty important places like public health care and schooling. So I wouldn't say that's impossible to achieve. I just say that up till now, the what most people think of communist countries, they just haven't really pulled it off correctly.
Yeah. All right. So that's basically all our thoughts today on the topic. As I mentioned earlier, one of the disclaimers: we are not experts on this branch of philosophy or the economic theory as well. Our talk is basically a layman's discussion about a very important philosophical aspect of our century, possibly a century before, when Karl Marx had his own ideas that spread like wildfire. Like any other philosophy or social theories, it has its own downfalls. But Karl Marx still remains as one of those thought leaders for all time to come. So we can certainly uh, learn a lot from his theories and his way of thinking. And certainly that has attracted many intellectuals world over. So thank you once again for watching us. And next week we'll be coming up with another philosophical school or a philosopher. Until then, have a nice day. Thank you.